Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to CRP's second session of the Connect 4 event series. I hope everyone can hear me okay. It's 4 p.m. and we've got 3 speakers for you today, as well as a Q&A session at the end for your chance to connect with these speakers so they can answer any queries that you may have that may come from their presentations. My name is Rachel Aldridge, and I'll be guiding you through the next 45 minutes of discussion, all on the global response to COVID-19, including developments in streetscape design to facilitate cycling and walking during the pandemic. So for today's session, our expert panel consists of Ross Phillips, Sustainable Transport Manager at Crossroad Partnership, who will be launching Healthy Streets Everyday guidance. We have Gordon Innes, Bloomberg Associates, who will be presenting on the impact of the pandemic on global tourism and how this has altered the function and fabric of cities. And finally, we have Ojay McDonald, Chief Executive at the Association of Town Centre Management, who will be focusing on the future and what lobbying the ATCM are doing to better support town centres, including specific things that public and private sectors, local businesses and local residents can do to help. Sorry. Jack Alexander, Project Officer at CRP, will be monitoring the chat today, so please do introduce yourselves there if you haven't already. So please ask any questions along the way through the chat and we'll answer these at the end of the session. And there's a Slido too. If you click the S on the top banner, you should be able to ask any questions to our presenters along the way, and also complete the word cloud to say where you're from in the UK or globally today. So just before we get going, CRP is a partnership delivering environmental, economic and community focused projects. We support public, private and voluntary organisations to address creatively challenges around air quality, transport, placemaking and wellbeing. On this slide is CRP's vision statement, which acts as a basis for CRP's delivery and has framed our latest annual report and business plan. We're continuing to work with the partners on screen to champion cleaner, greener ways of living and ensure the work we do improves the environment and supports our partners with their climate actions and goals. The next slide just shows how our Mayor of London Healthy Streets Everyday programme, Mayor of London funded, is actually coming to an end next month, but it's run for 3 years since 2019. The project has empowered boroughs, businesses and communities across London to deliver pedestrian-priority streets, increase walking rates and reduce emissions and exposure to toxic air. We'd like to thank the 26 project partners for all the work on the programme. Delivery for Clean Air Thames, similarly funded by the Mayor of London's Air Quality Fund, is also ending in March, and we'd like to thank the Mayor of London for the opportunity to retrofit vessels along the Thames, and more information can be found on our website. So to take a look at the Healthy Streets Everyday guidance, we're launching today on the global streetscape responses to COVID-19. I'd like to introduce my colleague Ross Phillips.
Hi everyone, thanks Rachel. So I'm Ross, I'm a project manager at Crossroad Partnership. I hope you can all hear me okay. So I'm going to be discussing how different cities around the world have changed their streets during COVID-19, which we've explored through this new guidance document for the Healthy Streets Everyday programme. So what are healthy streets? So the Healthy Streets approach is a global policy framework that embeds public health in the design of our streets. It aims to make streets healthy, safe and welcoming places for everyone by prioritising people and their needs. The approach is underpinned by 10 indicators used to create these healthy streets. It's being actively promoted by the Mayor of London and TfL across London. So as Rachel's mentioned, CRP's Healthy Streets Everyday is a cross-sector project to empower boroughs, businesses and communities across London to deliver cycling and pedestrian priority healthy streets. CRP and the Healthy Streets Everyday programme are excited to support changes to London's urban realm that promote active travel, greening, environmental health, car-free behaviour and economic resilience. These include things like school streets, parklets, local cargo bike schemes, Dr. Bike sessions, pedestrian priority streets such as lunchtime streets and much more. So a lot of changes have happened to our streets and how we move around our cities. Initially, our local areas shrank considerably, with many people staying very local for exercise, and remote working was prevalent. This led to very empty cities and streets, and some pretty surreal imagery seen across London of not much happening at all. So on the slides, there were pictures taken by our team during lockdown that lived nearby and enjoyed cycling around quite deserted London. So changes have been happening across the world, but with varying travel restrictions, we're unlikely to have seen or experienced many of them at all. So this has led to the creation of our latest Healthy Streets Everyday guidance document, which I'm delighted to launch today. It's called Global Streetscape Responses to COVID-19, Developments in Streetscape Design to Facilitate Cycling, Walking and Social Distancing. A link to this will be sent in the chat and shared around in the notes afterwards. We explore the responses of 7 cities across the world: London, New York, Nairobi, Bogotá, Seoul, Melbourne and Brussels. There were some really interesting and innovative schemes everywhere we looked, and I'll share some of these in the talk today. But through the document, we look at the different schemes implemented, including outcomes, challenges, funding and future strategies of each city. We hope that this will inspire local authorities, business improvement districts and the private sector organisations to deliver initiatives that support ongoing change to make cities healthier, greener, safer, livelier and more pleasant. So London's doing an awful lot on this, so I won't discuss the city as a case study, but I'll refer to it throughout a couple of examples of projects through the case studies we do talk about. So firstly, let's look at one of the pedestrian priority schemes in New York City. So firstly, air pollution is a big problem in New York, with the health effects equivalent for residents of smoking 3 to 5 cigarettes per day. But lockdown brought public transport and traffic numbers well down in the city, as much as 80 to 90% in some modes of transport. So some of the things New York did to support businesses and pedestrians was the New York Open Streets program, led by Mayor Bill de Blasio and the City of New York. So one open street was on Vanderbilt Avenue in the Prospect Heights development of Brooklyn, where a pedestrian priority zone was implemented on certain times on Fridays and weekends to encourage people to use the space, avoid driving, and to play outside. So these projects involved partnerships with the public and private sector to ensure their success, and involved innovative funding models and sponsorship schemes for large and small businesses. They also supported the local economy on Vanderbilt Avenue, as 22 restaurants participated in the programme. Restaurants saw an increase of 54% in customer visits, and there were 65 to 70 new jobs created in the area. So these innovative approaches and partnerships supported the local area and was set up by the Prospect Heights Neighbourhood Development Council. The scheme also received cooperation from the NYPD and sponsorship and branding for at least 10 businesses. So similar projects across London have been the Hammersmith Grove Parklet, which was funded with partnerships from Medidata, Hammersmith Beard and the local authority. So London's already thinking about very creative ways to fund and deliver streetscape changes too. The next example is looking at a cycling boom in 2020. The capital of Colombia, Bogotá, is reaping the rewards of half a century's worth of investment in cycling shifts and cultural shifts in cycling. So cycling and public transport is embedded very heavily there, even pre-COVID, through projects such as the ciclovias, where Sundays would be car-free across much of the city, and that's been the case since the 1970s. Nevertheless, when COVID hit, 22 miles of temporary cycling infrastructure was implemented very quickly across the city, with much more added since. So public bike sharing schemes help people to cycle, and much of the support was given to areas of high deprivation using mapping tools within the city and district government and mayor's office as well. And it's been reflected in the outcomes, which is great. The modal share of cycling has doubled from 6.6% in 2019 to 13% in 2020, and the city faces similar challenges to many others, with increasing bike thefts and difficulty over driver behaviour, which is something that they're looking to combat now. Nevertheless, we can learn from this that changes do take time, and cycling has been in the culture for residents of Bogotá for a very long time, but it's a very exciting time for the city and for the bicycle in the city as well. The UK's culture is gradually shifting, and updates to the highway code have been welcomed by the GLA and TfL. This is to help improve cyclist safety, but also cyclist counts across the city, which is really great news. And a final really interesting case study that we had is looking at the development of untacked societies and solutions in South Korea's capital, Seoul. So untacked is a word used to describe less human and physical contact or things that enable it to happen. So the use of technology and data is critical to Seoul's smart city strategy, as it's a way of becoming more sustainable and more technologically advanced. And one way that that's happening is the use of delivery robots for commerce and freight. This was something that was happening pre-pandemic, but the need to physically and social distance from one another has led to more untapped behaviour. So organisations such as Woowa Brothers and 7-Eleven have been using delivery robots in trials for the delivery of food and groceries in selected areas across Seoul and South Korea. 7-Eleven are currently conducting a 3-month trial for their groceries. Products can be ordered on an app, and the robot Newbie, which is pictured there, will deliver it right outside the apartment building. These are likely to be zero-emission ways of getting people their deliveries, which is great. But it's also interesting how the development of these untacked sort of things, like a conversation with a delivery driver, may be becoming less frequent in Seoul. And it's also creating a digital divide, which possibly marginalises certain parts of society that are less comfortable with technology. London's already doing some really innovative things with technology, such as artificial intelligence traffic monitoring too, and CRP's worked with Vivacity on some of this with partners across London. And finally, we've got some reflections that London can learn from all these case studies. London's doing a lot of really excellent things. We've noted that in the report, and even included London as a case study. But there's some really great learnings to be taken from elsewhere as well. So firstly, Seoul and Brussels were particularly innovative, one around their futuristic concepts, and Brussels had a really fast speed of delivery for their schemes. So this helped us to really realise the importance of ambition, creativity and delivery, and really pushing the boundaries. New York's Open Street programme on Vanderbilt Avenue was a great example of funding things a little bit differently through public-private partnerships and business sponsorships as well. These are all linked with New York's wider strategies across active travel and environmental health. So it's been a really interesting learning here too. Brussels' example highlights how decisions on streetscape interventions should be based on clear quantitative and qualitative data, such as monitoring and surveys. So the delivery of these schemes was supported by these bits of data, which was really useful and used to communicate with residents about its successes. Road safety is crucial to many of the projects discussed in the guidance document. Educational and engagement programs can be essential to address unwanted behaviours, such as those experienced in Nairobi. So it's really important to anticipate misuse and address any potential hazards. And finally, the street is at the heart of issues around economic, social, environmental and public health challenges. Encouraging collaboration can lead to more innovation, efficient processes and increased success and improved communication between all stakeholders as well. So that's it for me. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat, but thanks very much for listening and I hope you've enjoyed it as well and enjoy our guidance document too.
Perfect, thanks Ross. And yes, the guidance document's been shared in the chat as well as the press release for that as well, so definitely give that a read. Okay, I'll now pass on to Gordon Ines, Bloomberg Associates, and your kind of global perspective on tourism in cities. So over to you, Gordon.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly.
You can. Okay, great. I just you froze for a moment, so I panicked. So my name is Gordon Innes. I'm with Bloomberg Associates. We are a pro bono. Perhaps let me just take control of the slides, if I may. Nope. Okay, next slide. Thank you.
Gordon, I think you've actually got control of them now.
Okay, yeah. There you go. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. My name's Gordon Innes. I'm part of Bloomberg Associates. We are a pro bono consultancy that supports mayors around the world to improve the lives of their residents, part of Mike Bloomberg's philanthropic foundation. And although we're based in New York City, we're doing a lot to support the London Recovery Board and the efforts that the Mayor of London and London councils are driving forward for London's social and economic recovery. I've been asked to say a little bit today about the impact of tourism on cities, both pre and post pandemic, and how this has affected the lives of Londoners, but also the physical infrastructure and what we're seeing at the moment in terms of that impact and what we might be seeing over the next couple of years. Let me start with the central activities. This call knows what the central activity zone is. Most of Westminster, the city, and then the inner parts of the surrounding boroughs, so Camden, Islington, K&C, Wandsworth, etc. It's very much London's global city centre. In fact, it's the UK's global city centre, with world-class offerings, retail, bars, nightlife, arts and culture, heritage, etc. It's also an economic engine, so it's 10% of the UK's output, it's a third of London's jobs, and it's 3/4 of London's total office stock. And the dynamism, the diversity, the heritage is why it's a tourist magnet, and why the majority of tourism spend takes place in the central activity zone. But of course, that's been challenged since the pandemic. In 2021, that tourism spend fell by over £10 billion. And we saw only 4 million visitors to the CAS compared to 22 million back in 2019. We've also seen Londoners changing how they use their free time. Visits from Londoners to the CAS dropped by almost a half. And the forecasts are that the pandemic's impact on the central zone is probably going to be prolonged. Tourism numbers are not expected to recover until 2025. And all indicators point to a future of hybrid working. So we're probably looking at sort of 2 to 3 challenging years for the centre of London, where we'll either transition to a new normal, we will need to find ways to replace lost income, or there's a risk of vacancies and decline. And I would flag, I mean, this is not unique to London. Here in New York, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in Boston, other US cities are facing very similar challenges. And we've seen different cities respond in different ways. So New York, for example, has its Mrs. U campaign, which is very much about promoting Midtown Manhattan as an attractive location for residents and office workers to return. Boston has taken a slightly different approach. They are trying to broaden their appeal, particularly focused on Gen Z Americans and Black and brown visitors to the city who historically have been underrepresented. While some cities in California, places like Sacramento, are converting what they now perceive to be surplus hotels, motels, apartments, and other buildings, in some cases into permanent housing for homeless people, which was obviously a huge demand during the pandemic. And many development agencies in the US are repurposing retail space, not just shopping malls, but high street retail space for healthcare facilities, co-working spaces, event spaces, commercial kitchens, even schools in some downtown areas. Moving on to sport. Sporting tourism was the fastest growing area before the pandemic. It was growing 5 times faster than other tourism areas. I mean, again, London is synonymous with sports and international sporting events, but also with meetings and incentives, conferences, etc. Back in 2018, London was named the sporting capital of the world. And this has spurred, particularly since the Olympics, huge developments at the O2, obviously at the Olympic Park, West Ham Stadium, Spurs Stadium, the developments at Wembley. And there were plans, you can see on the right there, for Madison Square Garden to put an entertainment sphere into Stratford, which may or may not still go ahead. And these venues are particularly important because they don't only create venues for world-class tournaments that you can all enjoy, they also support significant local jobs, local amenities. If you take the Spurs ground, for example, that's the new station on the right there. The Spurs ground created 3,500 new jobs, pumped £300 million into that disinvested neighbourhood of London. It also created new public squares, 400 affordable homes, as well as funding for a new local academy and mentoring services for young people. So significant investment into Tottenham through that sporting investment. And of course, what we're seeing now is a lot of these investments or upgrades are on hold. In many rights holders, many event organisers have sold those businesses. Some of the suppliers in the supply chain have gone bankrupt. And we're even seeing iconic venues sort of at risk. It's forecast that the Royal Albert Hall could go bankrupt next month. Moving on to small business, tourism is incredibly important for household wealth creation and also for accessible and entry-level employment. Retail, hospitality, the nighttime economy, theatres, museums, galleries. 97% of tourism and hospitality businesses have fewer than 40 employees, and more than 80% are micro businesses with fewer than 10 employees. Many of them are family owned, many of them are local employers. They contribute to thriving town centres. In many cases, they're immigrant or BAME owned businesses as well. And pre-pandemic, they provided 1 in 7 jobs in London. And these businesses, I think, are really, really important and quite rightly have been a focus of national government and the mayor, because if we lose the diversity and inclusivity of those businesses, we really harm the London offer, but we also risk increasing the wealth gap because, as I said, many of these are the main source of wealth creation for households. Quickly on to tourism. Tourism makes a significant contribution to the operating costs of London's comprehensive public transport system. It really bankrolls Santander Cycles, which is concentrated in the CAS. Obviously, tourism also creates congestion, as you know, if you try to travel through central London on a weekend. In 2020, tourism ridership was only about 20% of the previous year. And so that, along with commuter ridership falls, have contributed to Transport for London's current £1.5 billion black hole. And so real world impacts there. We're seeing fare hikes. There's talk of some tube lines potentially being shut and up to 100 bus routes being pulled in order to cover those costs. Housing, there's very good evidence that tourism contributes to rising housing costs. Across the OECD, the average contribution is around 5% increase in housing costs. It's higher in London. Tourism creates higher demand for limited accommodation. Some wealthier tourists try to buy houses, and then again, which takes them off the market. And if you look at the CAS in London, house prices are around 4 times the national average, so very significant impacts there. Of course, ironically, what this means is that a lot of workers are priced out, including a lot of tourism and hospitality workers, which can lead to skills shortages. Tourism can also have very negative effects in terms of noise, air pollution, road traffic, plastic waste, rubbish. Tourism is responsible for about 8% of global emissions, and it can have a real world effect on residents' livability. We saw quite a backlash happening in places like Amsterdam, Venice, Rio before the pandemic. And as tourism is recovering, a lot of those cities are thinking about how they can manage tourism better, using smart technology to move residents to less congested spaces, encouraging waste recycling and single-use plastics, creating pop-up cycling lanes to help tourists move around the city, a whole range of initiatives that we're seeing. My second last slide, pleased to hear. The other sort of negative impact of tourism is really around the distribution of benefits. And this is both socioeconomically as well as spatially. The tourism hospitality sector has the highest proportion of jobs that pay the minimum wage of any sector in the UK economy. But also neighbourhoods outside the CAS typically don't attract many tourists apart from potentially as Airbnb serviced accommodation providers. And so because they don't see the economic returns, they then don't invest in the attractions, the better public spaces, facilities, etc. I'm almost out of time, so I won't read through this slide. I'm sure they'll be distributed after. There's 5 thoughts here around priorities for London as tourism recovers over the next 2-3 years. I think maybe I'll just say a little bit about the second last bullet here, which is the relationship between tourism and house prices. I think there's a real opportunity over the next couple of years while tourism is recovering for London to revisit the regulatory framework and what's required in terms of tourism accommodation. The mayor estimates around 65,000 residential units have to be built every year in London just to keep pace with demand. And we're seeing a lot of US cities at the moment using federal relief funds to convert surplus downtown hotels, Class B office accommodation into affordable housing. We're also seeing a lot of cities, I know London is doing this, looking to extend the tourism season to try and ameliorate the negative impacts on affordability. And a lot of cities, particularly in Europe, are trying to address the Airbnb effect of housing, whether that's through tax disincentives or supply limitations. Important as London is Airbnb's #1 market, and there is evidence to show Airbnb alone has had an impact on increased rents. There was a survey done before the pandemic that suggested that around 10% of UK landlords were thinking of moving their private rented properties to the short-term market. That equates to about almost 500,000 properties around the UK, or about 9% of the housing stock. So obviously, if that is taken out of the long-term market, that would have a significant negative impact on prices. And there are a number of policies which, while very well intended, could actually be accelerating this. The changes to the Tenant Fees Act, stricter letting laws, the energy performance certificate requirements, which are making it very expensive for a lot of landlords, the potentially ending no-fault evictions by abolishing Section 21 of the rental reform through the rental reform bill, and down the line this year, more expensive mortgages. So there is a risk that these could actually accelerate the process of taking housing and affordable housing, rental housing out of the market. I'm out of time. In fact, I'm slightly over time, so I will stop there. I hope that's been a useful, broad overview of the deep relationship that London has with tourism, particularly around the function and fabric of London. I hope you found it interesting, and I will hand back to Rachel.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Gordon, for your insights. Really interesting. And any questions for Gordon, please let us know in the chat and we will answer them at the end of all the slides. Yeah, just in the interest of time, I'll pass to Ojay now to give us some insight into ATCM's work. I don't know if you can take control, Ojay, or you'd like me to do the slides.
Rachel, could you do me the favour of doing the slides, please? I can't get control.
Of course, I will just upload them, I think.
Okay, I'll put on my very best Chris Whitty voice.
Oh, sorry, everyone. I'm going to have to bear with me. Almost there, sorry. I will hand over to you, Ojay.
Yeah, cool, fab. So while you line those up, I'll just start by saying, so I'm Ojay McDonald. I'm CEO of the Association of Town and City Management. We are a not-for-profit organisation whose members manage town and city centres across the UK and Ireland. Perfect timing. So what I'm going to talk about today is, I think from our perspective, within our industry, our membership and our network, we're all placemakers and we're all keen to see people-centric places. So in many ways, the road allocation we've seen during COVID has been sort of a blessing in disguise, and many of us have wanted to see how we can make that permanent. What I want to do is I just want to explore the breadth of changes that have taken place across the UK and the likeliness of some of those changes actually having some form of longevity, because it's not actually been all that straightforward, especially when you look at some of the smaller towns where the public transport infrastructure isn't there. Rachel, next slide, please. So when the pandemic hit, we immediately had from the now Department for Levelling Up guidance on some fairly radical reform to how we use space within our urban centres, looking at the reallocation of space for pedestrians, for people who are cycling, different forms of active travel, for businesses, for many different things. And those things were only possible with road closures. Rachel, next slide, please. And so this guidance was also backed up by the Business and Planning Bill in 2020, which was legislation to make it much more easier for businesses to apply to trade outdoors. Next slide, please. So in terms of understanding the breadth of changes which took place across the UK streetscape, ATCM actually worked on a survey on behalf of Channel 4 to investigate what changes took place and how happy people were, how satisfied they were with some of those changes. So this survey went live on the 17th of August in 2020. We had about 68 responses collected from our members across the UK. Next slide, please. So firstly, in terms of the extent of road reallocation, nearly 2/3 of respondents said that there had been either partial or full pedestrianisation of the core commercial area of their town or city centre. Around 34% said that there was no change to their high street at all due to COVID. Next slide, please. And success was not necessarily universal, not at that early stage anyway. So just over half of all respondents said that the changes that had happened, they were actually very unsure whether it was really positive. They were either unsure or had mixed feelings about the outcome of the changes, which was a much bigger number than we were expecting. Around a third found the changes positive, and actually 12% viewed the pedestrianisation as a negative change. Next slide, please. So you can see there's a big split there, and we had a range of views, a range of opinions, a lot of information which came in, which summed up some of the challenges we were looking at a local level. So just to give you a couple of quotes, one from either side. So our square was previously used as a pay and display car park, but has now been partially pedestrianised, allowing businesses to take advantage of additional space for seating. The square is now a vibrant place and somewhere people choose to dwell and meet, as it was designed to be. Next slide, please. But then you had this on the other hand. Businesses report a profit loss. Local people think the barriers look ugly and are not aesthetically pleasing. Disabled people are struggling to cross the road. On a windy day, barriers are blown into the road and pavement, causing dangerous obstructions. And that clearly speaks to one of the challenges we have, is that firstly, some of these changes were done quickly, barriers erected quickly, and don't necessarily fit with the aesthetics of the streetscape. And also we have to remember there are different users for any town centre space with different needs for that space, and certainly in terms of disabled people there were a lot of complaints to some of the changes almost overnight as a result of COVID. Next slide, please. I just want to finish on one particularly successful example of a transition in terms of streetscape, and I'm going to give you a plot spoiler here. I think for me, a lot of the challenges around the implementation of some of these schemes was probably around the fact that they had to be done with speed, and there was very little consultation to understand about some of the potentially negative impacts. So Liverpool Without Walls was something which was adapted for key hospitality areas like Castle Street, Bold Street and Lark Lane. And in some of those areas, there were specialised parklet solutions, which you can see on the right-hand side of the picture, which were put in place. Now, this turned out to be incredibly successful. And I think one of the reasons why is that Liverpool had a partnership in place before the pandemic. We know this because we work with them on their Purple Flag accreditation. That partnership is particularly strong. Now, the City Council, the bid company and the Chamber of Commerce working together to deliver this scheme. And because that partnership was already in place, in terms of this partnership getting together during the pandemic and being able to develop a scheme that would work for the majority of users, that is something they were able to enact pretty quickly and efficiently. Next slide, please. And because of the success, I think businesses found it really useful. There are a number of customers to Liverpool City Centre who love the scheme, who like the freedom of being able to use the road space. And so now there's a strong feeling that this is something which will become permanent, which would be fantastic to see. Next slide, please. But the truth is that this is not a universal feeling, and we've seen many places. We've had a parliamentary event around this particular topic, and we know, especially for some smaller towns, because that public transport infrastructure isn't there, because some of these schemes were put in at such short notice with very little consultation, in some cases there has been a lot of anger around the transition in terms of the streetscape. So however much we would like to see these changes becoming permanent, we know there's a lot of these schemes which have already disappeared, and it might be a challenge to bring them back again. And so for us, is what is the legacy of COVID? Can we really implement some of these changes permanently? It is not easy, but it is worth the try. And that's it from me. I'll hand back to Rachel.
Perfect. Thank you, Ojay, and a nice view to the future as we end that as well. I would just take the slides down for it's a Q&A with all the speakers. So yes, keep your questions coming. We will start with a question from David Kaner for Ross. How's accommodation of the needs of the freight industry built into the Healthy Streets guidance?
Yeah, so yeah, it's a good question. So I think firstly, freight is pretty critical for a city in general because it's pretty important to the part of the indicator of that focus on economic success. So things like things to see and do. Often people are visiting the areas that Ojay's just been through because it's things like food and restaurants and things like that, which rely very heavily on freight as well. In London, there's probably a move to look at zero emissions freight as well, or trying to time freight a bit more efficiently as well. But things like cargo bite schemes that we funded through the Healthy Streets Everyday programme to try and get businesses that perhaps would never have used those sorts of options before are really going to be really useful, particularly targeting smaller businesses as well.
Brilliant, thanks Ross. We'll come to Gordon. We have a question from Mark Atkinson in the chat. How can, what about retooling in instances where tourism has had a corrosive effect on local communities?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I mean, I think that retooling is, whether we're talking the small businesses or whether we're talking some of the workers in the industry, is an important aspect, an important priority at the moment, and probably should have been before the pandemic. So if we think about a lot of tourism businesses, retail, hospitality, the world is changing. Retail is changing. It will probably go back to the pre-pandemic trajectory, but that was already rapid change.
Oh, there's Gordon frozen.
There you go. To respond to changing consumer demands. I think for a lot of workers, as I flagged, a lot of tourism hospitality jobs are low wage. That they provide a lot of entry-level jobs, which is important, but we need to think about training pathways and career pathways. And all the evidence shows that the best way to progress people out of low-wage jobs is not necessarily within the sector and the industry, but actually it's a sort of a matrix to jump from industry to industry. And so thinking about stackable credentials, thinking about short-term training pathways to reduce some of that income inequality and get people into better paying London living wage or middle wage jobs, I think is a real priority. Particularly as it's been made worse, that income inequality over the last couple of years. So.
Brilliant, thanks, Gordon. For Ojay, there's a question from Tim Long. Do you publish any more information and advice on street space and road closures that support high streets and town centres?
So ATCM doesn't at the moment publish its own information, but what we do, so during the course of we have a Basecamp network, and we will share any information with regards to best practice, guidance, advice between placemakers on how to shape the streetscape during the pandemic. So we've got a special COVID group, which is absolutely free to anybody who wants to engage in that. And there's lots of support on there, and it allows placemakers to engage with each other to learn about what they can do around best practice in terms of the streetscape. And it is something which was discussed frequently throughout the pandemic. So you're more than welcome to tap into that group if you want access to that.
Brilliant. Is that something we can share after the event? Is there a link or something we could have?
Yeah, I think the best thing to do is probably just to email our membership manager, and she can get people onto the group. There's also for those who are London based as well, there's also a London High Streets group on Basecamp. Perfect. Which again is at the moment it's absolutely free and is specific to any issue around the pandemic.
Amazing. Okay, I think we've got time for maybe one more question each. So, Ross, we had one from Russell from Complete Business Solutions before the event. What do you consider the easiest low-hanging fruit in fighting against the rollback of cars dominating the spaces that were required in the adoption of active travel and space reallocation that we saw during the pandemic?
Yeah, so I think Ojay has looked into a couple of these as well, and I think one of the really interesting ones that we've definitely seen is around things like streeteries across London, where perhaps parts of roads or all of roads were turned into sort of hospitality and dining areas as well. Well aware that they do change things for delivery drivers as well. I know there's a couple of questions that have come through the chat about that for deliveries and servicing and what it means for them as well. And obviously accessibility is always going to be a challenge with something like this as well, and should be considered from the moment that it's implemented. But ultimately, I think schemes like that have been very useful for sort of economic recovery of areas of sort of high density hospitality businesses or economic areas as well. So I think they've been really interesting. They've encouraged people to walk. They've encouraged people to cycle to there, because often they're in areas that can be slightly more cyclable as well. So I think, yeah, they've been really interesting too.
Thank you, Ross. And for Gordon, what can local residents do to help the recovery of UK towns and cities and support their high streets?
There you go. So we heard a little bit about this in terms of local buy programs. As I mentioned, I mean, a lot of local businesses, local high street businesses here in the States, what we bring local services. They're often family owned. They're more likely to employ local residents. They're more likely to contribute to local communities than chain stores. And so we've seen a real rise of programs, buy local programs, not just residents supporting those local stores with gift cards, with local purchases, but also businesses, anchor institutions. We're helping to set up a program in London at the moment for the big anchor institutions from NHS London and University of London, the Met Police and others, to do more in terms of local purchasing. The boroughs can play a role in that, supporting local capacity building so that residents can be better in engaging what their needs are. It was in the chat, challenges around Soho when outdoor dining was introduced there. So making sure that residents are on board with initiatives like street activations, food truck markets, outdoor dining, etc. But this can all be part of the solution to encourage residents to purchase more locally, which is also obviously more sustainable as well. So.
Thanks, Gordon. And the last one for Ojay. What examples can the UK take from New York City in regards to streetscape interventions?
Oh, that is a big question. That is a big question. I think, firstly, it's I mean, one of the things New York has done, and this is pre-pandemic, is it's the innovative use of places which you wouldn't even think of as a street, which has been redesigned and reallocated as a street. And I think the main example I can think of, and there's already an example now of this coming forward in the UK, is the New York High Line, taking a disused railway line and turn it into something special. And I think Camden have picked up the mantle on this and are running forward with it, which is great. How can we get innovative in using that disused space and transforming it into something which activates active travel? Because then that issue around the sort of conflict between different users of space disappears if this particular space is unused. And I think that's a key innovation we probably need to get better at here in the UK. I think the idea of the open street scheme as well in New York, I love it. And I think to an extent, maybe we already do that when we have big events in some of our towns and city centres and we have road closures and we bring people in for festivals, whatever it might be. Maybe we need to get better at formalising that, understanding the economic benefits of that, and using that as a platform to think about how we can revolutionise the way we use our streetscape more permanently.
Absolutely, and there's a link to the Camden High Line as well. Thank you so much for your questions, everyone. I'm aware we're slightly over time, but and joining us today. We will be sharing our contact details as well in a follow-up tomorrow. And I believe there's a link for our next session, which is taking place on 31st of March. We're speaking to Jacobs and Momentum Transport about mitigating the impact of road traffic in cities through kind of legislation and innovation. So please join us if you're available for that one. But thank you so much, Ojay, Gordon and Ross as well for presenting. And yeah, hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Gordon.